Get started. Okay. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out on this afternoon. I'm David John, the president of Greene County Historical Society. We're here today to acknowledge the 175 birthday of Iowa. Right? And also to learn a little bit about Iowa history. Before we do that, before we get started with that though, I have a little thing I want to do. I'm going to read the Iowa song. I'm not going to sing it, but I'm going to read it. Right. And I want to know who knows what you do when you read the last or sing the last line of that song. Does anybody know what you do?
Amen. Stand
No? Something else.
Oh, I think I know. Does anybody else know?
You take. Anybody know?
I think you wave like the tall corn.
You raise your hand, right? Or you wave. Thank you, Chuck. Okay, here we go. When I read the last line, everybody raise your hand. Okay? We're from Iowa, Iowa, state of all the land, joy on every hand. We're from Iowa, Iowa. That's where the tall corn grows. Okay. Okay. Now, an Iowa boy, Chuck Offenberger, is going to introduce our speaker for our program, who also is an Iowa boy. Chuck.
Thank you, Dave. I have one other thing to say in terms of an announcement. You've probably heard that we've had this exhibit, Dig It, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And we've had different programming, and the next thing on the agenda is January 22nd, Saturday night. We're going to have a music concert at History Boy Theater that we've hired a 5-piece band from Des Moines led by Heath Patchell, who's one of the finest musicians in Iowa today. And they're coming up and they're going to play Dig It, the music of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And the band was put together not only on musical ability, but on storytelling ability to talk about these songs. And so we are looking forward to that. I was supposed to meet with the band last Tuesday night to interview them and get pictures, and the keyboard player, Justin Apple, got sick. And in this era, everybody backed off, no rehearsal, until they could find out what was going on. And yesterday he was confirmed with COVID. And so he's out because he can't rehearse. He might be ready otherwise, but he can't rehearse. And so Heath Patchell called me yesterday and told me that, and I was thinking, well, who knows what this is going to mean. He said, but we picked up somebody who's played with me a lot on different events over the years. He's very good. He'll step right in with us, and I think you might like it. We picked up Tanner Taylor. And I said, well, sorry to hear about Justin Apple's COVID. We'll certainly take the hometown hero and bring him in here. And another Jefferson guy, Todd Mason, will also be playing bass that night. So it's a really good group. They'll be here. That's a $2,000 show for us, and we're letting you all in free. And it's going to be a great time at History Boy Theater that night. And we've booked sponsors to pay for the fee for the band and for the theater. And so the sponsors for that are Jefferson Telecom, Bet and Bev's Barbecue, the News and Opinion website, Offenberger.com, and we're looking for one more $500 sponsor. So if anybody knows one or wants to step up, just let me know. But it's going to be a great time. I just told Michael beforehand that when I was at the Des Moines Register, I think it was Lefty Mills, George Mills, the old political columnist and storyteller, pointed me toward the Register's coverage of the 1946 Iowa Centennial. And I was really thrilled by that, and I read a lot of stories about all of that and was really intrigued, and I started thinking, well, the sesquicentennial is going to be coming up in 1996, and I am sticking around at least that long so that I can cover that thing, and I did, and had a great, great time. It was a wonderful event in Iowa, and I know it was in Greene County here too back then. You did a wonderful job back then. And in 1998, Terry Branstad was making his last farewell tour around the state, we thought. But he was having, coffees around the state to tell people, because he was ending his 4th term as governor. And we were driving down the road, and I told him about that I had decided to stick around to cover the sesquicentennial. And he said, that's interesting to hear that, because he said the truth is one of the biggest reasons I ran for a 4th term was so I could be governor during the sesquicentennial celebration, which I loved hearing. To have a birthday party for Iowa on its 175th anniversary in Greene County just couldn't be more appropriate to have a Morain as a speaker. And we weren't going to be able to bring back Tom.
Dang it.
Yeah, Vicki Morain says, and we all agree. But I thought next best bet is Michael Morain, who was communications manager for the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, which means he's also does stuff for the Historical Society of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, Produce Iowa, is that the name of that, Michael, that does the movies in Iowa, and the Humanities Iowa, now a new name.
The Iowa Humanities Council.
Iowa Humanities Council. So he's busy all the time. He's telling stories about Iowa, probably more than he even was when he was writing for 10 years for the Des Moines Register as the art reporter and covered music. He grew up in Ames, as you may recall, and then he went to Graceland University in Lamoni, got out of that, eventually he taught school for a couple of years, went back to Northwestern in Chicago and got his master's degree, and then landed at the Des Moines Register with some other stops across the nation and around the world. But he's a masterful storyteller. He's a fun guy, witnessed by his participation on RAGBRAI in coverage for the Des Moines Register, but as the kind of the anchor man on the Register's pie eating team for the annual contest with the team from National Public Radio. When they come on RAGBRAI, they're not National Public Radio, they're team NPR, no pie refused. So they're serious pie eaters. But I want you to join me today as we welcome, it seems like welcome home. It's always that way for the Morains in Greene County, Michael Morain.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, all of you, for braving the weather to come out on this big day for Iowa. I imagine that this group over the years have heard a lot of stories from a lot of Morains, so I hope you enjoy the cake. You came and you made it. If you were smart, you got here early and you already got your cake. If you were a little later, I won't mind if you go and get some cake. Don't be polite and wait for this whole show to finish. So, I am a Morain who knows a little bit about a lot of things, unlike my uncle Rick, who knows a lot of things about a lot of things. But we're going to zip through some stories of Iowa history today, and I will tell you, I'm very excited to be here. I'm delighted to be in Jefferson. There are it's sort of all hands on deck at the State Historical Museum today for our big day. And I am almost excited as this guy on the slide right here. He's delighted to be here too. His name is Ansel Briggs, and he was the state of Iowa's very first governor. And all year long in all of our newsletters, on our e-blasts and our website and all of the things we've been using to promote the 175th anniversary, I keep trying to slip this photo in, and it always gets vetoed. But today I'm in charge, so Ansel Briggs gets the place of honor. And really, Roger was standing right up next to it, and he looked a little bit like Ansel Briggs. A little bit. But I can tell he's smiling beneath his mask, so the similarities end right there. All right. The next person also looks very excited to be here, and he is technically the reason that we are here today. That's President James Knox Polk, the 11th President of the United States, and he was the one who signed the bill that added Iowa as the 29th state in the Union on this day exactly 175 years ago. At the end of the day, wherever he was, I assume he was in the White House, he jotted a note in his journal. This is a copy of the page in his journal. You can see it if you squint. It says the date right up top. And the very last line is magnified on the bottom, and it says, "Nothing of much interest occurred today." So thank you, President Koch. Thank you for that auspicious start. As far as I know, there are no plans to add that to the welcome signs on I-80, I-35. We're just going to leave it in the diary. But today we will go easy on him because we are Iowans and we are gracious. And he could not have imagined how remarkable the next 175 years would turn out to be for Iowa. Even the president couldn't have imagined what great stories Iowa would produce and what great Iowans Iowa would produce. So we thank him for his signature and we'll call it good there. So over the next 175 years, President Polk could not have imagined that Iowans would help lead the charge for women's suffrage. Iowans would teach Amelia Earhart how to fly. She saw her first plane at the Iowa State Fair when she was a little girl. We developed hybrid crops that helped save at least 1 billion lives. That's sort of an outdated figure by now, so who knows how many lives Norman Borlaug helped save. We dreamed up Nancy Drew and made her into a bestseller. We have sung in opera houses all over the world. Sometimes we choose the president and sometimes we choose somebody else. We invented the tractor. We invented a machine to slice bread. We invented Rice Krispies treats. Yeah, that's a big deal. We invented the frozen treat formerly known as the Eskimo pie. So we did all of these things. That's just a quick review. I'm sure the A students in class already knew all that stuff. But I don't know if you remember the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding. In it, there's a character. It's Grandpa Gus, I think, and he believes that Windex is the cure-all for everything. He sprays Windex on everything, and he's a very proud Greek American immigrant. And he likes to play a game where he tells people, give me a word, any word, and I'll tell you what its Greek origins are. And so he does this all the time, and people kind of get frustrated with it, and so they sort of roll their eyes. And there's one character who says, okay, fine, kimono. And he sort of thinks on it, and he figures out some way to explain that it has Greek origins. So on a day like today, it is tempting to suggest that it's tempting to exaggerate Iowa's role in history. You know, that Iowans played a pivotal role in all human endeavors. As far as we know, Iowans did not build the Great Wall of China. As far as we know. We did not write Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. There are a few things that we can't take credit for, but one thing that Chuck and I have both learned at the Register, there is an Iowa connection to almost everything. And if you really work at it, there's an Iowa connection to everything. Sometimes it's a little tenuous, but there is an Iowa connection to everything. So today, we will look at some of those Iowa connections. Another thing that I learned actually right before I got to the Register, when I was in journalism school, there was a chart like this in the journalism textbook. And if you have ever taken a journalism class, you've seen something like this. They're called news values. I don't know if in the back you can see, but the circles have elements that make something a news story. These are the things that news folks kind of know internally to help them decide what is news and what's not, to help decide what goes on the front page of the Jefferson Herald and what to bury way back in, back in page 4, 6, or 16. So around the circle you have magnitude and prominence, an element of conflict, proximity, timeliness, currency, if it's unusual, something about, and also stories about the human spirit. So the best, newsiest stories have all of those elements. But the advantage of history is that you don't have to pay any attention to timeliness. When you're writing a newspaper or when you are producing stories for the news, you kind of have to work with what you got, what happened recently. But if you are working in history, you can stretch back as far as you want and choose the best stories from lots and lots of years, as far back as you want to go. So today, I just chose 7 stories that I wish I could have covered as a reporter for the Des Moines Register. I will not argue that these are the most important stories. I won't argue that all of these were turning points in Iowa history. Some of them clearly were, but these are stories that I wish I had been there with a notebook and an excuse to be a little nosy and interview the people who were involved with the story. I'm sure at the end of this, you may have other ideas for stories that you wish you had sort of lived through, and we're probably grateful that there are some stories that we weren't around to see. So we will start in 1971, and we'll sort of rewind. So we'll start in 1971 and go all the way back 175 years, give or take. This woman, in the middle of both pictures, is Maria Pearson. Maybe you know her. I don't know what I will be teaching to this group. You seem like a smart bunch, but indulge me. In this photo is Maria Pearson, and she, her Native American name was Running Moccasins, and she was a member of the Yankton Sioux tribe, and she was married to the tall guy on the outside of each photo. His name was John, and he was an engineer for the Iowa DOT. And he came back from work one day in 1971 and was telling about their project in Glenwood, just south of Council Bluffs, where a construction crew for the DOT, they were repairing a highway or building a highway, and the construction team discovered the remains of 28 humans. So 26 of them were identified as early European American pioneers, and they were very carefully reburied at other cemeteries in the area. The 2 left in that discovery was a Native American woman and her baby, and they were not reburied. They were sent, their bones were sent to the state archaeologist's office in Iowa City. And when Maria heard her husband tell her this story, she was furious. And so she decided, she wasn't a political person, she wasn't an activist, but she put on her Native American dress, and I think it's the one on the left. I'm not quite sure, I think it's the one on the left. And there's a necklace there, full Native American dress, traditional outfit, and she drove to Des Moines and she marched into Governor Ray's office and she sat down and said, "What are you going to do with my ancestors' bones?" It's safe to guess that Governor Ray had not been thinking about that when he woke up that morning, but she sat there in his office until, he listened to her and until he carved out some time to hear her story. I wish I could have interviewed the receptionist at the front desk who was there sitting, watching her all day and just sort of like, but that was in 1971 when she marched into the governor's office without an appointment and said, "What are you going to do about my ancestors' bones?" In 1976, the Iowa legislature passed a law that protected Native American grave sites and established 4 Native American cemeteries around the state. And then that served as a model. That was the first law of its kind in the United States. That served as a model for a federal law in 1990. And in 2002, Maria Pearson, Running Moccasins, was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. My battery in my laptop is running low. Is there another, never mind, I got it. Hang tight.
While he's doing that, I'll scan the crowd. And then you can watch
All right.
on Jefferson Telecom
All right.
next week, and you can identify or tell your relatives, yes, I was there when that happened.
So I have a question about a mother and a baby. Because if I remember right, in the Iowa Historical Building in Des Moines, there used to be a mound that had the remains of a Native American mother and a baby. When I was a child, I remember seeing that, being intrigued by it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that that is no longer part of the exhibit, but I was just curious about what happened to those kinds of artifacts.
I believe you, and you're right. It is. I'm sure it is no longer there. I'm sure it has been repatriated, and often what happens with those artifacts, we defer to the Native American tribes, and they have the say on what to do with it. So often there's a ceremony, a burial ceremony. But that's an interesting. Thank you for that memory. Looking back, it seems strange to us, and like, how could they do that? But we have the advantage of hindsight. So, yeah. All right, this next story happened in 1960, and actually it started the year before. In 1959, there was a typhoon that ripped through the Yamanashi prefecture, a state in Japan just west of Tokyo. And it was just devastating. The typhoon ruined crops and homes and farmland and all of that. So there was an Iowa man. He's standing second from the right. His name is Richard Thomas. He grew up in Des Moines, and he had served in the U.S. Air Force. He was stationed in Tokyo for a while, and in Yamanashi Prefecture after World War II. And he went on to work at the Pentagon. So he was working in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon when the news of this typhoon in Yamanashi spread across the world, because it was awful news. And so he decided, well, we can help. Maybe Iowa can help. Maybe the U.S. government can help. So he arranged, he was in cahoots with friends and family back home, and he arranged for what we now call the Iowa Hog Lift, where Iowans sent 36 hogs across the Pacific Ocean with 100,000 bushels of corn over to Japan to help with the relief efforts. And what I learned in this, just in digging up the story, this was before jet cargo planes. So the planes that they used to transport 36 hogs in special aluminum crates, they had to island hop from island to island across the ocean. And there were a couple farm families, the president of the Iowa Corn Growers Association and his wife, they were all on board. And at each island, they had to stop and wash the hogs to keep them from overheating. The whole trip took 40 hours. So the next time you hear horror stories of airplanes, just remember that you weren't 40 hours in the air with 36 hogs. Fortunately, most of them made it. One hog overheated, so it was 35 hogs by the time they got to Japan. But so it was a big success, and the Iowans helped teach and help coach the Japanese how to raise these hogs using Iowa techniques and all of that, so that 9 years later, when the last of the original hogs died, those 35 hogs had produced 500,000 hogs in Japan over 9 years, which the Japanese people were very grateful and very appreciative, and it helped heal tensions after World War II. This was, not so far after World War II, and things were a little dicey still, but that was sort of sent an olive branch and helped heal tensions between those countries. So the following year, the governor of Yamanashi came to visit Iowa, and he rode in the Drake Relays Parade, and he visited an Iowa farm. And the two governors, it was Norman Irby, I think, at the time, they signed an agreement, and that created Iowa's first sister state partnership. In the mid-1960s, Harold Hughes, he visited Japan. He had a conference in Tokyo, and he took the train south a couple hours to Yamanashi Prefecture, and he wrote this. I toured the farms, including the hog barns, which are enhanced with fresh flowers in vases every day. My Japanese guide explained that was for the benefit of the hogs. When he pointed to then the interpreter pointed to thousands of swine and said, "From Iowa." I remembered the Japanese friendship bell, recently installed at our state house grounds, and thought how some 20-odd years before we were deadly enemies. I glanced at my interpreter and estimated him to be my age. If I had been sent to the South Pacific, we could have killed each other. Since then, there have been all kinds of cultural exchanges between Iowa and Yamanashi Prefecture, the latest of which is the Blue Ribbon Bacon Festival. So this is from 2017, and these are Japanese school children in hog costumes. So there's always an Iowa connection. There's always an Iowa connection. The next story is a little bit similar, where hogs play a leading role. I wish I had been here in 1959 when Nikita Khrushchev visited Iowa and visited Coon Rapids. It's hard for me to picture what that was like when the leader of the evil empire comes to Iowa and visits a farm visits the neighbors down the road. I mean, the Garsts were unusual neighbors for certain, but I cannot imagine what that was like. There were wonderful photos in the Register, and this certainly didn't need another reporter to cover it. I mean, it was very well covered. But I wish I had been there to see it, because there are photos of people lining the streets in Des Moines with all kinds of signs, welcoming signs and signs that were less welcoming. This is one of them. I don't know if you can read it in the back, but the man on the left is holding a sign that says, "The only good communist is a dead one." Welcome to Iowa, right? This, and I just ran across this. The boy in the right is Harry Bookey, who's a prominent developer in Des Moines. He and his wife transformed the Temple for Performing Arts, which hosted Des Moines' first Starbucks. I mean, history, you guys, history. But here he is as an 11-year-old in Des Moines, and the quote in the Register, he's telling Nikita Khrushchev, he's saying, well, you beat us to the moon. The Soviets beat us to the moon. Sputnik had been, or no, yes, Sputnik had. You beat us to space, thank you. I knew there were A students in here. You beat us to space, but we can beat you in sausages. What? So there you go. This is the crowds lining, this is the parking ramp right across the street from the Hotel Fort Des Moines where Nikita Khrushchev was staying. This is students peeking in a building, it was the Home Economics building at Iowa State. Here, every photo, people were climbing on things. So here are more hogs and reporters climbing on the fence to get photos of the Russian delegation at the Garst farm in Coon Rapids. And Roswell Garst got so tired of the reporters, he was so frustrated that he picked up silage, corn silage, and just started throwing it at the reporters and the photographers who were just getting on his nerves. And Liz Garst remembers that her grandmother, Roswell Garst's wife, was so mad that this photo appeared in in worldwide papers that he was throwing corn silage at reporters. She was like, real classy, real classy. But what I love about this photo, so there's Nikita Khrushchev in the light suit right in the middle. Roswell Garst is next to him, and their corresponding wives are there. Liz Garst is earlier that morning she had been wrestled into a scratchy white dress and pigtails that she did not care for. But what I love about this photo is many people, I'm sure in this room, have family photos that look a lot like this, right? But here is, in the middle of it, is the leader of the Soviet Empire in the middle of this family photo. I just think that's remarkable, and in some ways such an Iowa thing. Like if somebody shows up, you give them pie and some coffee, and you show them around the barnyard, and you have a good afternoon. In Morain, when the Morain extended family gets together, when we take a photo like this, my dad often joked, he often invited a stranger to just stand in the back to confuse future and descendants, like who is this person, right? Now who's that? So here's someone who has a different story than the rest of the family. But Liz Garst, the little girl in the white dress, many years later, on one of the anniversaries, she wrote this. She said, "My grandfather thought he could do anything he wanted. He was the sort of guy who would write the Pope letters or get on the train to yell at the Secretary of Agriculture. He thought that what he said could influence things." Imagine that, right? I think that lesson carried on to Liz Garst. I hope everyone in the room recognizes this next photo, because these, I think, if pressed, these are my favorite characters from Iowa history. These are the Cherry Sisters. And if there is one story, if I had to choose one story that I could have witnessed, it would be the Cherry Sisters of Cedar Rapids. In 1896, the Broadway producer Oscar Hammerstein was losing money. He was going broke. He needed a hit on Broadway. He had tried his best to find good shows, so he tried something else. He invited the Cherry Sisters of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to come play a Broadway theater. And they could not sing, they could not dance, they could not tell jokes. They were awful. And so New Yorkers came to see if it was really, if the reviews in the paper were really that bad. Could they really be that bad? And they did not disappoint. Here is a quote from the New York Times in 1896. "Never before did New Yorkers see anything like the Cherry Sisters from Cedar Rapids, Iowa." The next day, the New York Herald wrote, "Did you ever hear the musical kerchunk of the half-flooded milk pail as the brindle cow kicked it over with her off-hind foot? Well, that was Lizzie's voice. Did you ever hear the frightened squeak of the rooster when your sister-in-law's firstborn jumped on him hard with his little copper-toed boots? If you didn't, you won't appreciate Jessie's song of Fair Columbia." Their names were Effie, Addie, Jessie, Lizzie, and Ellie, and their names live in infamy in Iowa history. In New York, it is rumored, I don't know if this is exaggeration, but it is rumored that the sales at vegetable stalls near the theaters went up. Melons and rutabagas, prices went up because they were in high demand. And the producer, I don't know if it was Oscar Hammerstein or one of the impresarios, actually rigged up a net across the front of the stage to encourage vegetable throwing. Who knows? But it was an experience, and people needed to see the show for themselves, to see it with their eyes and hear it with their poor ears. So after their big success in New York, they went on tour and they came back to Iowa and they did sort of a victory lap around Iowa, if you can call it that. And Iowa reviewers, not to be outdone by the reviewers on the East Coast, they also took a turn trying to put into words just the experience of seeing the Cherry Sisters. So a critic for the Audible Chronicle wrote this, and it was reprinted in the Des Moines Leader, a long-gone paper. "The Cherry Sisters, their long, skinny arms, equipped with talons at the extremities, swung mechanically, and anon waved frantically at the suffering audience. The mouths of their rancid features opened like caverns, and sounds like the wailing of damned souls issued therefrom." That's just good writing. So the Cherry Sisters, they had hit their limit, right? So they sued, and the court threw out the case. And so they appealed the case and said, "Come on, that's really mean, you guys." And the Iowa Supreme Court ruled against them in what turned out to be a landmark victory for freedom of the press. The gist of the Supreme Court's ruling said there's no such thing as a false opinion. Everyone is entitled to his or her own opinion without getting sued, so you can write whatever you want. Sorry, Cherry Sisters. So the story has a little happy ending, a little bit, at least for the rest of us. It's that it turned that they are champions, accidental champions of press freedom. So give it up for the Cherry Sisters. This was, in 1869, there was a solar eclipse, and it was big news across the world, really, and it made all the prognosticators, they forecasted that it would start, the viewing path would start up in Alaska and scoop southeast really all across the country, and Iowa was sort of in the sweet spot. So the trail of the viewing pattern was going to go from Sioux City to Cherokee to Jefferson to Des Moines to Ottumwa and Burlington. So Iowa got a good view of this solar eclipse. So people came from as far as Montreal and London. It's hard to know how many people came to Iowa, but it was a big event. I don't know if you can see it, but this was a shack, sort of an astronomy shack that was built temporarily in Ottumwa. You can see the telescope there. So there were really interesting, colorful accounts in some of the papers. This is what the Burlington Hawkeye had to say. During the solar eclipse, men walked more softly and spoke in lower tones of voice. And for some minutes before the appearance of the moon, the hum of conversation had died away. The members of the party were all at their respective spots, and expectation was on tiptoe. Spectators in Davenport noticed an instant change in the atmosphere. Temperatures dropped 5 degrees. Swallows and doves flew back and forth, confused by the sudden darkness. Groves of trees took on strange colors, changing from dark green to vapory yellow, and then to a deeper shade of green. After the solar eclipse, stars disappeared as sunlight returned, and birds sang to welcome the new sunrise. There was a professor from Pennsylvania named Charles Himes who wrote this about it. He said, "Favored as we were with a sky free from cloud or haze and a beautiful point of view, this phenomenon left an inerasable impression upon our minds and hearts." There was another professor, an astronomer named D.J. Eaton, who wrote a report for the U.S. Navy, and he said this: "I have climbed the Alps and visited London, Paris, and Rome, but would sooner lose the memory of them all than of those 3 minutes in Burlington." This was the last solar eclipse in the Midwest during the 19th century, but it was the first to be photographed. So by 1869, photography had developed enough that people could take photographs of it. And as far as we know, there were 160 published photos of this phenomenon. And those photos led to important discoveries. Scientists concluded that the corona, that cloud of magnetic wind around the sun, is a permanent part of the sun. And they also identified something called Bailey's beads, which is an effect when the sun shines through the valleys on the surface of the moon. It must create some sort of lights or they call them Bailey's beads, which I had never heard of, but they knew about it way back in 1869 because they could photograph solar eclipse for the first time. Just a few months before, that was in August, and this was in May in 1869. On May 10th, this is a photograph of the ceremony to connect the Transcontinental Railroad in Promontory Point, Utah. They had a ceremonial golden spike, and they drove it in to connect the 2 branches of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the news about this ceremony, there was one telegraph that went around the world, and it was just one word: done. Because there had been so much anticipation for it, people knew what that meant. There's an Iowan in the middle of this photo. It's Grenville Dodge, and he is right in the middle, shaking hands. He's the guy on the right. He's that guy right there. There's our man Grenville from Council Bluffs. And I think that Iowa has produced lots of geniuses, lots of really smart people. If he's not at the top of the list, he's right up there with the smarty pants of all time. He, really, really interesting guy. He was born near Boston, and by the time he was 14, he was surveying railroads. In his early 30s, he served in the Union Army and quickly climbed the ranks. His background in railroads as a railroad surveyor helped him help the Union Army rebuild railroads and bridges and telegraph lines. So he was a key person with some smarts and some know-how. Right guy, right time, right place. He also organized a ring of spies, of more than 100 spies, to work for the Union Army. And that spy ring included women and enslaved African Americans in the South, and various whites in the South who supported the Northern cause. Really smart guy. After the war, he really took on this task of building the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, it was a huge operation, as you can expect, but he was one of the masterminds behind it. And I think from one day to the next, I can't find my car keys, but he masterminded how to buy land and how to get the supplies there and how to make sure that everybody, that there was enough workers. Like, all of the logistics to make that happen is is unimaginable to me. I'm just impressed by him. He also is the guy who persuaded President Lincoln to route the Transcontinental Railroad through Council Bluffs. So Chicago won out, and instead of scooping down south through St. Louis and St. Joseph, I think, those were rivals. Sorry, St. Joseph, we got it. So he, and I think there's a story where President Lincoln had a free afternoon. He was in Missouri, and so he took a boat up the Missouri River at Grenville Dodge's request, and Grenville Dodge hosted him at his house in Council Bluffs. It's up on the hill on one of the bluffs. And he showed President Lincoln, you know, this Council Bluffs, this could be a good spot for railroads. And that turned, I mean, for a while, Council Bluffs was the center of the universe because so many train railroads were going through Council Bluffs. Just another footnote, this is where we get the term online and offline that we still use in internet times, if you're online or offline. And it was really important for towns to be online, to be on the railroad line, because if you were offline, even by a few miles, that train isn't going to stop. And it changed the course of communities and how they developed. After the Transcontinental Railroad, he was hired all around the world to help other countries build railroads of their own. He built major railways in Mexico and Cuba and Germany and France. He also helped build the Trans-Siberian Railroad. In his house, there are gifts from leaders from all over the world who thanked him for his work on the railways. One of the Russian czars sent a big samovar. It's like a fancy teapot. It's in his dining room, and you can see it in Council Bluffs if you go tour. So if there's one person I could interview, maybe the Cherry Sisters, they're at the top of the list, but then maybe Grenville Dodge. Okay, this is the last story, story number 7. And this story is not really about this guy. This is Charles Mason, who was the first Chief Justice of the Iowa Territorial Supreme Court. So I'm cheating a little bit. We're back into Iowa territorial days. Charles Mason, he graduated with General Robert E. Lee from West Point, and he was the valedictorian. He beat General Lee by just a couple points. Not that it matters, not that we're keeping count. But he was in charge of this Iowa Territory Supreme Court, and issued the opinion about, it's called In the Matter of Ralph. And this story is really about Ralph, who was a formerly enslaved man from Missouri, who left Missouri to buy his freedom. He signed a contract with his former owner. And so Ralph came up to Iowa. He was going to pay off his freedom by working in the lead mines in Dubuque. Over time, he was going to send money back to Missouri and buy his freedom. It didn't work out. He couldn't make enough money in the lead mines, so his former owner, Mr. Montgomery, sent bounty hunters up to Dubuque to collect him and bring him back to Missouri. Really awful, sad story. But it has a happy ending. So the bounty hunters, they came up to Iowa, they went to the sheriff, and the sheriff arrested Ralph, and a neighbor heard about it. A neighbor caught wind of the story real quickly, and he went immediately to another neighbor in Dubuque, who was one of the associate Supreme Court justices, named Thomas Wilson. And this is what the associate justice wrote about the account. Alexander Butterworth, a noble-hearted Irishman who was plowing in an adjoining field, soon heard of the arrest and came immediately to my home and demanded a writ of habeas corpus. An attorney drew up the application, and it was granted. The sheriff overtook the parties at Bellevue, and Ralph was returned to Dubuque. The case was heard, but at my suggestion, it was transferred to the Supreme Court of the territory because of its importance, and there it was unanimously decided that Montgomery's contract with the slave, whereby he was permitted to become a citizen of a free territory, liberated him, and that slavery did not and could not exist in Iowa. This was the very first decision of the Iowa Supreme Court. It was delivered on July 4th, 1838. And in the record books, in its label, the opinion is called 1 Iowa 1, just using the terminology. That is a win for Iowa. As Iowans, we can walk a little taller because of that decision. So here's the handwritten, here's Charles Mason, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote the opinion. Here's his handwritten opinion. A few years ago in Dubuque, at Ralph's gravesite, they erected a new monument to tell the story a little bit. And there was a dedication for it, people gathered. And at I'm sure you've seen this monument on the hilltop near the current Iowa State Supreme Court building. There's this monument called Shattering Silence, which a lot of Iowans contributed to raise money for this monument that tells the story of Ralph and a lot of the civil rights victories that have come in the years since. We tend to think here in Iowa that most of the important stuff happened elsewhere, that most of the big important history took place with important people in important places that are not here. But that is not true. That is one of the many lessons that I learned from my father, that Iowa and Iowans have just as much claim to an important history and important stories as anybody else on the planet. And these are just 7 of the stories that I wish I could have been there for to see with my own eyes. Dad served for a while on the Iowa History Advisory Council, which helped, a few years ago, they advised the Department of Education to set up standards to sort of beef up Iowa history in curriculum across the state. And they published a report with a catchy title called Recommendations to Create a Systemic Approach to Improving the Teaching and Learning of Iowa History in Iowa's K-12 Schools. Catchy. And this is from the summary, and I have a hunch I know who wrote this summary. For too long, Iowans have allowed the outside world to tell us who we are and what our place in the world is. For too long, Iowans have accepted those judgments because we know so little about our own history. As a result, many of us believe that the state's past is historically insignificant, monocultural, and boring. This simply is not true, and our young people need to know that. Given the opportunity, Iowa youth share a fascination with the stories of the rise of their hometowns from riverbanks or tallgrass prairies, of the arrival of immigrants from all over the world, and of life before the internet, telephones, and automobiles. They are amazed to learn stories of famous scientists, athletes, artists, inventors, activists, and politicians who are from neighborhoods just like theirs. They are curious about how their own communities came to be and where the traditions they know so well came from. When the State Historical Society kicked off this year, the 175th anniversary year, we developed a whole bunch of programs throughout the year for people to learn more about our history. And there was, the historians on our staff they made 2 big points from the get-go. One, they wanted to recognize that Iowa did not start 175 years ago. This place and its people have been around for thousands of years. That's an important point. And also, there's a difference between celebrating an anniversary and commemorating an anniversary. It's not all good stuff. I highlighted some stories that, we can be proud of, but it's not all good stuff. Earlier Iowans made mistakes. Current Iowans, we are making mistakes. It goes both ways. But there are things that we can be proud of. There are things that we can celebrate, even during the commemoration of 175 years. The value of Iowa history, beyond just having good stories to swap and know about, the value of Iowa history is learning about earlier Iowans who rose to the challenge of their own times. In most cases, these earlier Iowans didn't set out to do extraordinary things, but they did the best they could with what they had. I think in the last 2 years, and I certainly appreciate this more working at the State Historical Society, we are living through a turning point in history. Usually we don't recognize it. Most of the people in these stories, they didn't know that they were going to be in the history books. They were living their lives. And it was hindsight when they realized that, what they did landed in history books. I think over the last year and a half, during the pandemic and other moments of tumult in the last year and a half or so, I think most of us recognize that one way or the other, this chapter of our time is going to land in the history books. And we've made mistakes, and we're muddling through, and there will be good stories and bad stories from this time. And the State Historical Society is helping chronicle those stories for future historians. So early on, we sent out a call to gather artifacts and stories from Iowans. How has the pandemic affected life in Iowa, so that we can tell that to future historians? Many of you are wearing masks. That would have been very strange 3 years ago, but times have changed, and we have changed with it. So there are challenges today, and what we can learn from history is examples of other people, ordinary Iowans like ourselves, who have risen to the challenge of their own times. So how can we do that? If we would like to rise to the challenge of our own times, maybe we can do it if we stand up against injustice, like Maria Pearson, if we share our abundance, like Richard Thomas and the Garst family, if we act with courage, like the Cherry sisters, and perseverance, if we follow our curiosity, like the people who watched the eclipse, if we persevere and rely on teamwork, like Grenville Dodge, if we help our neighbors, like Alexander Butterworth, who helped Ralph at a time of need. I'll give the last word to Hugh Sidey, who grew up in Greenfield. He's sort of Greenfield's version of Rick Morain. He wrote an essay 40 years ago that the Register republished this Sunday for the 175th anniversary, and he has a way with words. Iowa lies between a lot of things. The state is hemmed by two great rivers, the Missouri and the Mississippi. To the north is the lakeland, the endless necklaces of water that the final glacier left just beyond Iowa's border. And above the Iowa land is the sky, which an Iowan knows is an ocean of sorts, constantly shifting and swirling, capable of great rage and healing calm. Iowa is none of these things alone. Iowa is all of them, blended by a providential alchemy that must be felt to be understood. Iowa is people and land in rare harmony. Iowa is order and serenity and invitation and eternity. It is not a state that dazzles or explodes or shouts. It is not allegro or fortissimo or the clash of cymbals. Iowa is melody, the wise voice of cellos and the smooth notes of the horns that knows what has gone before and believes in the future. Thank you. Are there questions? Anybody? There's cake. I'll be around if you have questions. Are there any questions for the group? Any stories you would add to this list, or stories you would strike? That's fair too. How many of you were here and remember Khrushchev's visit? Was that scary? Was it exciting? Was it something that you talked about? Or was it just sort of in the papers? Yeah.
I was in elementary school in Irving, and we took a bus and went to Gary to watch him drive through.
Yeah.
But it was a big one.
Yeah. The same thing when I was at the Register and I was on RAGBRAI, the first year that Lance Armstrong came, it was a big deal and everybody was on Lance watch. And all the reporters lined up in towns along the route to see who could be the first one to spot him. And I stood on the road next to a woman who she owned a bar, I forget where it was, and she had saved the last tenderloin for Lance Armstrong so that when he came by, he would eat her tenderloin. And we waited for hours on the side of the road. And Lance whizzed right by. And she was so mad, she almost threw it at him. She just like, ugh. But yeah, it happens fast. Did you had a Khrushchev memory?
I was in school with Carol, so I was going to share the
All
same
right.
piece of information.
All right.
Interestingly, a friend who was a little older than us, he was a part of the National Guard, and they were stationed periodically along the highway road from Des Moines to Coon Rapids.
And he swears that he had a loaded rifle and was ready to shoot anyone. Now, when Liz tells the story that they were just, Liz Garth tells the story, they were just there for more decorum, but he had a loaded rifle.
All right. There's stories and stories and stories. Yeah.
Two questions. You had the picture of the Golden Spike. Did Iowa have another connection with that railroad? That's my first question. And then the second one involves the Lincoln Highway.
I don't, by that point, by the time they finished the Transcontinental Railroad, there were already, different branches working their way across Iowa. But I guess I don't know if Iowa had another direct connection to that one. I'm not sure. What's your other question?
Was about the Lincoln Highway and how important that was to the history of Iowa.
Very. Actually, again, I know a little bit about a lot of things, but what I do know about the Transcontinental Highway, and it was again a race to see who could find the route, and it, as you would guess, it really. Towns lobbied for it, lobbied for and against it to come through their towns. But there are great stories, fascinating stories about railroad auto races and organized races to see which automobile would make it first across the state on newly paved roads. It sounded a little reckless, but they're really good stories. I wish they would teach them in driver's ed training classes.
Michael, it just occurred to me that there may be some people in this room who don't know this, but your dad's book, Prairie Grassroots, describe what that was and how he went about that, telling that story.
Sure. So Dad was, I don't know, in his 30s, maybe? I don't know. It was a while ago. And he had to figure out a way to be paid as a historian. So he got a sponsorship from Home State Bank, and they paid him to conduct a series of oral interviews here in Jefferson with people. This was in the 80s, early 80s, with people who remembered Iowa in the 20s, give or take. And so he interviewed a lot of old timers in Jefferson and with a lot of help, transcribed those interviews, and those notes turned into a book that traces the sort of the early middle years of Jefferson. It really focuses from about 1900 to about 1930 in there. And it really made use of the Jefferson Herald, clips from the Jefferson Bee and Herald. Dad, when he was growing up, he didn't realize it, but the resources for that were in the family basement. There were, there were bound copies of the old paper. So he mined those and combined those, wove those together with oral history interviews of Jeffersonians, and published it into a book, and which you can check out at Jane Millard's public library. She can help you find it. And Jefferson has done a wonderful job cataloging newspapers, local newspapers, so that there's a digital collection, you can search it. Not all towns have that, so good for Jefferson, good on you for preserving those stories. Yeah.
I have just a little note about Prairie Grassroots. I was a classmate of Tom's, and at one of the all-school reunions, Karen Springer, Pope, and Kay Springer, Moran twins, and I rode the bus to Jefferson to school. And of course, Tom got to go home for lunch every day, and Mama cooked him great meals and so forth. And I told him how much I had appreciated that book, and that my experience was very much like because he talked a lot about the town folks versus the country folks, and that farmers and so forth. And he says, "Oh no, I just made that up." And I, honest to God, the Springer twins and I almost attacked him for saying that he made it up because it was so true tonight. And he said that he always wanted to ride the school bus, and he always wanted to have school lunch. And we called him out for the liar that he
Good. That's good. One of the stories that he liked to tell about the difference between town kids and town families and farm families, with rural electrification, when there was the movement in the 30s, I think, to plug in all the surrounding farms to electricity. Often the very first thing that farm families made was Jell-O, because they could get a fridge, and before it was an icebox, and it's hard to make Jell-O in an icebox, but when they could make their own Jell-O at home, like the town families, they were like, that was big living.
I think one of the comments that you made about the young man making sausages, back in my day, it was bookie pack.
Oh.
There was a bookie packing plant.
All right, that makes sense.
And I am assuming that was what the heritage was.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, there's still cake. Go get some cake. Happy anniversary, Iowa.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was just brilliant. It was fun, too. It was a totally appropriate message for 175th anniversary of Iowa. When you read that thing that you suspicion that your dad wrote about in the Iowa History Advisory Council's conclusion in that crisply titled report, but when you got to that, I hope you'll share that with me, and we will bring it up in the historical board. I think we want that on a plaque somewhere on this building or in this building, because it says it all about the importance of Iowa history. It was just brilliant. I'd never heard that before. Thank you very much. Now let's eat cake.